Let me start with you, Rajin. Do you think that the South African consumer is in a pretty healthy state, a pretty good shape?
Well, if you look at the numbers as of the end of September 2011, and we track the number of people that have got impaired records, people that have got cars and houses, South African consumers are coping with regards to the repayments on their large items.
That's very interesting because there are a number of things. Also, there's been a report about the number of South Africans who are buying new houses and so on. Is it because people are in good shape, or is it because banks are starting to be pretty generous in credit extension?
I mean, if you look at the numbers as of September, we've seen an increase in credit granted. And if you look at the December numbers, we haven't published it yet, but going back on past history, the December period is the busiest period in terms of credit granting. And if you look at the motor vehicle sales, and if you look at last year, the rand value of credit that was granted for cars was quite high. So most of the people would buy the cars in December with regards to on credit.
Because again, I was just talking about the house prices. People are saying that house prices are cheaper than in 2007 and so on, which may be true or maybe a marketing gimmick. Do you think people are falling for that?
Well, if you, as I said, I mean, in 2007, for every 1 rand that was granted, 50 cents was for the mortgage. And if you fast forward to now, for every 1 rand granted, 30 cents has been granted for a mortgage. So we've seen a massive change in the way credit is being granted in South Africa. You must have noticed there's a spike in unsecured credit lending in terms of store cards, credit cards, and unsecured personal loans. So the market has changed from granting of houses to other sorts of credit.
And what is your view of that? I mean, is that good or bad?
Well, from the NCR's point of view, we have had meetings with all of the largest credit providers in terms of exactly the change in the market, and there's lots of reasons as to why the market has changed from financing of houses to other sorts of credit.
You know, it's quite interesting because I think at the height of the financial crisis, people were talking about banks not extending credit, not only to individuals, but also to companies that wanted to do business and so on. It appears as if 2 years later, that trend seems to have reversed.
The NCR only tracks numbers on credit that is granted to individuals. And if you look at 2009, South African banks have curtailed. I mean, there was around about 50 billion rand granted in 2009. And if you fast forward to 2011, that's gone to around about 80 billion rand. So we have seen an increase in credit being granted over those periods of time.
And this is when then we should be careful about how we access and use that credit, Magauta.
Yeah, from the NDMA's point of view, we are still quite concerned because if you look at the Credit Bureau monitor that the NCR issues, of the 19 million people that are credit active, we have about 6 million people that are in arrears with their credit and about 3 million that have judgments and administration orders against their names. So for us, that is still a big concern, although the trends are showing that the number of consumers with impaired records is slowing down. The increase is slowing down. We still feel that the figure of consumers who are impaired is still quite high, and we still need to work very hard to reduce that number.
Let me just ask you this, whether you have a problem with the fact that banks in particular or any other financial institutions are granting credit pretty easily?
No, I don't think in terms of the law, you know, they are able to do that. But there are other challenges relating to the information that is available to them when they assess affordability. Some of that information you are able to verify, for example, from a pay slip, from a bank account, but a lot of that is hidden information, unverifiable. For example, if you look at affordability, you would ask a consumer how much they spend on groceries, how much they spend on essential things, in addition to the other debts that they have. And a lot of that information is not verifiable. We still have issues with Credit Bureau reporting where the updating of Credit Bureau information sometimes takes about a month, when from the time you take out credit until it's registered at the Credit Bureau. So in between that time, you could be lending to a consumer who's not supposed to be receiving that credit because their affordability is excessive. So there are still challenges in that area, but legally they are not allowed to do that.
What are your thoughts though, Paul? Are we well advised as consumers on how to treat debt?
I think what Magauta has just said about the income levels of many of the people who get into trouble suggests that even those people who have access to the information don't act on it. But there are these two sides of the coin in the South African situation, of course, where a lot of the people get into problems with credit are poor people who often don't manage what little money they have and will grasp at whatever credit they can get for various reasons. And that, this issue of consumer education, financial education, I think it's an ongoing concern. I don't think we're addressing it in the schools where we should be. By the time people get into university or into even earning positions straight out of school or college, they need to have a foundation of financial skills that they simply don't have. And I think, some of our schools are addressing this, but generally speaking, we just don't see enough of it coming out of the financial institutions, out of government, and the civil society side of this is still very weak.
I just wonder, though, whether it's a uniquely South African problem, or is it generally people like to live beyond their means?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the state the world is in at the moment. Our global financial system has been literally brought to the brink by what we would consider the most successful capitalist economy on the globe, and that's the United States, and that is people being sold stuff that they simply can't afford. There are also institutional aspects to that, but at the same time we can see in retrospect that it's very easy to convince people that borrowing money for what they want is a good idea. You don't need to work hard at that at all.
Does that happen a lot, do you think, around this time, Regine? There's always this perception that around this time, financial difficulties, people have spent a lot of money over the festive season and they'll borrow. But does that happen?
Well, we've been tracking the numbers from 2007, and in every December there's been a spike in credit. I mean, your retailers are advertising credit, your furniture stores, buy now, pay later, 0% interest, 3 months. So those things happen in December. And obviously January comes and we see most of the consumers would go for your short-term debt, unsecured lending, to try and cover those expenses that were incurred in December.
Magauta, let's talk about the successes, if there are any, of debt counselors.
Being an institution that actually deals partly with complaints against debt counselors, I think it's a mixed bag. The debt counseling process itself have its own complications, and what we have seen is that some consumers that go under debt counseling don't understand the implications of going under debt counseling. They don't have enough information to be able to engage properly with the debt counselor and with the credit provider and to monitor the process. And a lot of the time we receive complaints where houses and cars are being repossessed and debt counseling is being terminated because of those sorts of complications.
What are these complications, though, that you're talking about?
Usually consumers don't understand that being under debt counseling, that doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the debt, that the credit provider has to accept the proposal, the offer that you are making, and that offer has to be confirmed by a court of law. So a lot of the time you would find that and the fact that that process has a limited time period within which it has to be completed. And if it's not completed within that time, which is about 60 business days, the credit provider, if you are in default, has the right to terminate and take legal action. So in that area, in terms of the options that are available to consumers to deal with a financial crisis, with over-indebtedness, there's still a lot of education to be done.
Paul, my sense is that talks to consumer activism in this country.
Yeah, Kwalani, as we know, the consumer movement in South Africa was probably stronger under apartheid than it is now, where we had people standing up for issues related to consumer rights, which had a political edge. And these days we don't see enough of that. And it's a sad thing too, because we are, I think, as a country looking for a stronger civil society generally, and consumer rights is possibly one of the most important areas. People daily are coming into contact with potential conflict situations and with decisions that can affect the rest of their lives. And I really do think that we need government agencies and those civil society groups that exist to come together much more effectively to try and marshal our forces and make sure that there is consumer education getting out there and it's reaching people where they are, rather than headline campaigns that get into the big newspapers and not beyond.
In terms of the national credit regulator, then, Rajin, do you have any responsibility in order to, when it comes to assisting consumers know what's their right and what they should be doing?
Well, if you look at from inception of the NCR, we received around about 400,000 calls from consumers regarding debt. And out of that, there were around about 11,000 actual complaints. And we have resolved around about 97% of those complaints. And we've given back around about 4 million rand back to consumers. So we've seen an increase in complaints against consumers. But as Paul said, I mean, every consumer has got a right to a free credit report. We've got 18 million consumers. And for the past 9 months, only around about 240,000 consumers have accessed the free credit report.
Okay. Let me make me understand this. You say we have 18 million consumers? I would have thought we've got 50 million.
18 million credit active consumers.
Oh, okay.
Okay? Out of 18 million credit active consumers, only around about 240,000 of them have accessed the free credit reports. So what does it tell you about the South African consumer? Why are they not accessing this free report? I mean, you're entitled to one free report a year on your anniversary date of your birthday.
We're talking about your money. We're talking about the state of the consumer in this country, what should be done, and what are the pitfalls, what should you be avoiding. Magauta, perhaps this one for you. What's the difference between debt administration done by a lawyer and debt review done by a debt counselor? Which one is better?
Phew. Well, in my view, administration is very problematic. We have had problems with administration orders in a long time because the problem is that it's a court process and the consumer really has to pay a lot of fees. And the way the money is distributed, for example, it's distributed every 3 months, which means that the credit provider gets very little. Sometimes the money doesn't even get to the credit provider. And you can only go under administration if your debts do not exceed 50,000. So it's really for small debts, whereas debt counseling does not have a limit. The advantage with debt counseling is that debt counselors are regulated by the National Credit Regulator. If a debt counselor doesn't do his job, doesn't follow the law, you have an avenue to go to in order to lodge a complaint. Whereas with administration, you have to go back to court because the administrator is appointed by the court and the administration fees are quite high.